makes up for it. If not, that's all I got. So, I'm a graduate student at Georgia State, finishing up my first year. I just found out that I get to teach Intro to Philosophy this summer, which is super great. I was dreading having to teach critical thinking. So teaching intro is going to be fun. I got my BA in philosophy from the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. Some great people there. Terry McConnell, Gary Rosenkrantz, Joshua Hoffman, Bax Vandervossen. Some tremendous minds are there. So I have an interest in philosophy of language, which is why I'm talking about sarcasm, particularly language that's non-literal, language that seems to work when it ought not to work, when we say things that aren't true or say things that we don't mean and yet somehow still manage to effectively communicate. That's interesting to me. It might not be interesting to you. And so that spans into sarcasm, metaphor, allegory, and then even more interestingly and even more fun, literature, fantasy literature. So I get to talk about Lord of the Rings a lot. Not so much today, unfortunately. There's not a lot of sarcasm. I tried really hard to find some sarcasm. The best I could find was just some witty stuff that Saruman said, and those are mostly just lies and not sarcasm. So sorry, not a lot of Lord of the Rings. So what is sarcasm? Well, it's got some negative connotations, right? You think about someone who's sarcastic, it's a person who's not generally nice. I think that's a bias. I've been called a sarcastic person my whole life. Part of that is just, I think, the tone of my voice. I just sound sarcastic, and I just sort of sound like a jerk when I talk to people, and I don't think I am. Maybe. But I don't think so. I think sarcasm has got some bad raps, and so when I found out that there was such a thing as philosophy of sarcasm, I said, well, I've got to do this, because I've got to find some way to justify myself as a human being, and if nothing else, if sarcasm is philosophically interesting, and if I'm sarcastic, then I'm philosophically interesting. There's some sort of logic in there, right? There's some sort of transposition or something that works out. So sarcasm has got some negative sort of vibes about it, and not unfairly. Sarcasm is generally hurtful, generally sort of snarky, and the word means, right, in the Greek, to tear the flesh. So there's that. Even in early Greek anyway, it was to tear the flesh. Later on, sarcasm in Greek came to mean more what it means to us. It meant to sort of jeer or jest or mock or sneer. So more like what it means to us today. And what sarcasm is turns out to be sort of a controversial question. Like everything in philosophy, right? It's a controversial question with some answers, opposing answers, and people get really into it about this. The standard view of sarcasm was laid out by Quintilian a couple thousand years ago when he said, we understand something which is the opposite of what is actually said. And that's a pretty good summation of what sarcasm is. If I sarcastically say to you, great job, I mean the exact opposite of that, right? Horrible job, right? So generally speaking, we say that sarcasm is the opposite, or it's to be interpreted as the opposite of what's actually said. Paul Grice says that we're speaking sarcastically when we as the speaker exploit a mutually shared assumption that we could not possibly have meant what we said. So I say something to you, you fall in the hallway, right? Like I almost did coming down the hallway. It's just been a bad day. You fall in the hallway and I say, great job, right? What Paul Grice says is that I am exploiting with you, we mutually together share an assumption that what I said I could not have possibly meant, right? I can't possibly mean that you did a great job by slipping and falling in the hallway. And then he goes on to say that the speaker of a sarcastic utterance must be trying to get across some sort of proposition other than the one he purports to be putting forward. Right? So we're talking about the opposite of what's being said is sarcasm. His intended proposition must be obviously related in some way to what was actually said. So if you fall in the hallway and I say, great job, that's somehow related to what I mean to say, which is, you fell, that was a horrible thing for you to do, you should have been more careful. Whereas I can't say if you fall in the hallway, look at the pretty bird, and that be sarcastic, right? It's not related in any sort of way to what I'm saying. So it has to be related in some way to what I'm actually saying. That is my intention. It has to be related in some way to what I'm actually being said. And the most obviously related proposition is the contradictory proposition. So the opposite of what I'm saying is the most obvious thing, what I'm trying to get across. If you fall and I say, great job, the most obvious relation between what I'm saying and what I mean would, to Paul Grice, be the contradictory one. Bad shouldn't have fallen. And then he goes on to say that if it's not the contradictory one, then its relation, that means my intention, the relation of my intention to what is actually said, is so ambiguous that the utterance would just become pointless. So what Paul Grice is arguing is that either sarcasm is where we intend to get across the opposite of what we say, and if it's not that, then it's pointless, and yet somehow we're able to communicate through sarcasm, so it's not pointless, so it's got to be this opposite of what's being said. And that's the standard view of what sarcasm is, that we say something and what we intend by what we say is the opposite of what is actually being said. The standard view of sarcasm has been challenged by a view what Elizabeth Camp calls expressivism. Elizabeth Camp's not an expressivist, and that's Elizabeth Camp with an S. She's at Rutgers. She recently left UPenn, so she's at Rutgers now. She's the one who got me started on this thing about sarcasm. She's written a few papers on it. So she calls this view expressivism. And expressivism claims that sarcastic utterances don't involve the inverse of what's being said, and they don't involve any non-literal meaning at all. The only meaning that a sarcastic utterance has is the literal meaning, which seems really strange. If you fall in the hallway and I say, wow, great job, the expressivist is going to say, what you mean by great job is not the converse or the inverse, bad job. The only meaning in your sentence is the literal meaning, great job. That what I'm saying and what I mean is literally you did a great job, and what I'm doing by using it sarcastically is to hold it up as an object of ridicule and not do the inverse, not intend the inverse. I'm holding up a literal true proposition as an object of ridicule. And we'll look at that in a little while, a little bit more. And then we'll look at a few varieties of sarcasm. Linguists classified maybe as many as 24 types of sarcastic utterances. I think that it really just boils down to 3 main kinds of sarcasm. Dr. Camp has 4. We're not going to talk about that one because it's so close to the first one that we're going to talk about that it would take way too much time to try to separate what she calls the lexical sarcasm from propositional sarcasm. So it just takes too much time. For all intents and purposes, they're basically the same. So we'll look at 3 varieties of sarcasm: propositional sarcasm, like prefix sarcasm, like we need your support, and then illocutionary sarcasm. So expressivism, what I said earlier, is where the expressivist is going to say about sarcasm that the only meaning that I have in a sarcastic utterance is the literal meaning. And that seems to go against all intuitions that we have about sarcasm, right? That what we say is not the literal meaning. That's why it's sarcastic. And so important words to get across before we move into expressivism, laid out by J.L. Austin in his book, his great book, How to Do Things with Words, is locution, illocutionary act, perlocutionary effect. You probably know those, but just in case, there they are. Locution, illocutionary act, and perlocutionary effect. The locution is simply just the thing I say. It's the words that come out of my mouth. The things that I'm saying right now, that's the locution. The illocutionary act is what I mean when I utter the locution. So when the judge at the court says, I now pronounce you, husband and wife, those words, that's the locution. His illocutionary act is what he means to say is, I am now creating this legally binding contract that makes you a married couple. And then the perlocutionary effect is the thing that happens after the judge says it. It's the effect of those words. It's what he does with the words. So what he says is, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What he means is, this is now a binding contract, and by uttering these words, I'm creating this legal, I don't know what else to call it other than a contract. And then the perlocutionary effect is, these 2 people are now married. That's the effect of what he's done with his words. So we need to sort of get those things laid out what that is. Locution is the words, illocutionary act is what I mean, perlocutionary effect is the effect, it's what happens when I use these words. Okay? Even if you get my meaning wrong, it doesn't matter. What you do with my words is the perlocutionary effect. Not only when it happens the right way, even when you take my intentions and my meaning the wrong way and do something else. So if I say, where's my marker, or I have a marker. If I say, where's my marker, and what I mean by that is, I don't know where my marker is, can somebody look for it and give it to me, and what you do rather is just point to it and say, it's over there, my intent, right, my illocutionary act was to get you to hand me the marker because I don't want to walk over there and get it, but what happened instead was that you just pointed to it and told me where it was. So even if my words fail, that's still the perlocutionary thing, okay? So that stuff out of the way. What expressivism is then is just a really complex position, but basically what it says is that when we utter something sarcastically, we're not saying the inverse, we're not trying to communicate the opposite, we're mentioning a proposition in order to hold it up as an object of ridicule. So what I mean when I say something literal, like, hey, great job, and I say that sarcastically, is that I literally mean to bring up that you did a great job, see that it conflicts with reality, and then hold up that literal proposition as an object of ridicule. I think is a sort of strange position to have. So if I sarcastically say to you, thanks for helping me with that, I'm uttering a locution, thank you for helping me with that, and I'm saying it sarcastically, right, because you did help me with it. My illocutionary act then is, if I'm saying it sincerely, my illocutionary act is to get across to you, you did something worthy of praise, you helped me, and I want to offer up some sort of praise to you for doing this praiseworthy thing. But when I utter it sarcastically, I'm doing something different. I'm holding up this literal proposition, and I'm saying, look at how you've helped me, and look at how you've done a great job in a praiseworthy thing. But you and I have this mutual knowledge that you didn't do this praiseworthy thing, and so we hold up this crazy thing as an object of ridicule, and that's what sarcasm is. It seems a little strange, but that's the expressivist position. It's not the opposite. It's the literal. You only mean the literal thing when you utter something sarcastically, and you're trying to make fun of the literal thing because it doesn't fit with the world. So, I think it's an interesting position, and it can be true in a lot of cases. I think you can hold up a literal proposition as an object of ridicule. I don't think it ranges over all the instances of sarcasm. I don't think expressivism works for all instances of sarcasm, like prefixed sarcasm, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I think that the traditional view that we intend the opposite of what we say can range over all instances of sarcasm. I think that's the correct position. The expressivist position only accounts for a few sarcastic utterances. More importantly, holding up as an object of ridicule some proposition just doesn't seem to be what most people actually think they're doing when they utter something sarcastic, and what someone thinks they're doing with their own words is important for what it is. So that out of the way, there are some controversial views as to what sarcasm is. There's another one called semanticism, which is not really worth talking about. Needless to say, I disagree with it. But the main one, and the one that's just seems to be closest to the truth, is the expressivist position, except for the right position, which is just the traditional view, that when we say something sarcastic, we mean the inverse of what we say. So there are some varieties of sarcasm. Like I said, Elizabeth Camp has 4. Lexical is the 4th one. I'm not going to mention it because it's so close to propositional, which is our first one, that it's not worth delineating, really. So propositional sarcasm is the most straightforward case of sarcasm that we normally see. There are utterances in which, were these utterances sincere, the speaker would be committed to some proposition. That's why it's called propositional sarcasm. So some simple cases are something like, you're a great friend, uttered sarcastically, right? Not literally. You're a great friend. If I meant that sincerely, then I'm committed to the proposition that you are a great friend. If I say, the ladies must really love you, right? And I say that sarcastically, or if I say that sincerely, what I'm committing myself to is the whole proposition. The ladies must really love you for whatever reason, right? But when I say these things sarcastically, what I'm doing is setting up a proposition. I'm asserting a proposition. It carries some sort of evaluative attitude towards what's being uttered. And were these utterances sincere, I'd be committed to the evaluative attitude expressed in that proposition. So I'm evaluating you when I say you're a great friend on some sort of scale. So there's really bad friends and there's best friends, and I'm saying you're a great friend. And if it were uttered sincerely, right, I'm committing myself to you on this evaluative scale. In uttering them sarcastically, however, I'm pretending to assert this proposition, you're a great friend. So there's some proposition P that I pretend to assert. I pretend to assert the proposition, you are a great friend. I literally say it, it's a locution, and I'm pretending to assert this proposition, you're a great friend. But what I'm actually asserting is its contrary, some other proposition, Q, right? You're a bad friend. So in propositional sarcasm, I have asserted a proposition, pretended to assert a proposition P. What I actually am asserting is its contrary, call it Q, and I have the correlating evaluative attitude towards Q. So were I to say you're a great friend sincerely, I assert this proposition, you are a great friend. It's an evaluative sort of proposition about who you are, and I'm committing myself to you on this evaluative scale. Uttering it sarcastically, however, what I'm doing is pretending to assert P, actually intending Q, and my evaluative attitude is actually towards Q. And that's propositional sarcasm. And it also works for interrogatives, like questions. So if you come to the party and you get a giant piece of cake, or you eat half the cake, and I sarcastically say to you, hey, would you like some cake? Because I don't know how to say it sarcastically. But if I sarcastically say to you, would you like some cake? Because you've been eating too many pieces of cake, it's the same sort of thing. It's an evaluative sort of thing. I'm evaluating that you are on a scale, right, of how well you eat. You're doing poorly. I'm pretending to assert this proposition wherein I want to offer you some cake, but actually I'm asserting its contrary. I'm telling you you've had too much cake, stop eating my cake. And I'm evaluating you on that level. All right? So, and if I say, don't you just love it when Dan comes to visit? And I don't really like Dan, or the other person doesn't really like Dan, but I say, don't you just love it when Dan comes to visit? And I say that sarcastically, it's an evaluative thing, right? I'm saying, it's great when Dan comes, right? But what I'm intending to get at with this question is, it's horrible when Dan comes, right? It's a bad thing when Dan comes. And because we've got this sort of mutual assumption about who Dan is, or how much cake someone ought to eat, or that thing you're doing is really dorky and the ladies don't love you, you and I have this mutually shared understanding of what's going on. Then when I speak to you, I can communicate to you, even though what I'm saying is not literal. You can understand it. So it requires some sort of theory of mind that you can look at me when I utter something sarcastically. You know that I have beliefs about the world, and yet what I'm saying is contrary to my beliefs about the world. And that's kind of how propositional sarcasm works. The other one is the second one rather, is like prefixed sarcasm. Like the sort of Valley Girl sarcasm, or you can call it as if prefixed sarcasm. So this is like propositional sarcasm, like prefixed sarcasm also has as its target the entire proposition, and yet it doesn't pretend to assert a genuine proposition. It prefixes it with the like, and then what follows after is the sarcastic. So if you say, like I would ever marry him, you're not pretending to assert a genuine proposition. So it's different than propositional sarcasm in that way, in which propositional sarcasm, it's almost as though you are, or it is as though you're pretending to assert some proposition. With like prefix sarcasm, there's not that sort of pretending. Like I would ever marry him, the speaker means this sarcastically, but she's not pretending to assert the statement genuinely. Like if she were to say, well, he would be a great husband, sarcastically, in which she asserts a proposition, she is sort of pretending that it's a genuine proposition. What she means is the opposite. The like prefix takes away the need for us to sort of interpret it as contrary. It still means contrary, because after the like, she says, I would ever marry him, which sort of kind of says I would marry him, but that like prefix then takes away the need for me to interpret it like I do propositional sarcasm by sort of evaluating your beliefs, and there's no evaluative nature to the like prefix sarcasm. She's not saying he would be a great husband. It's just like I would ever marry him, and that's the way that it works. So some like prefix sarcasm, it seems, is just a stylistic choice. It could be subsumed under propositional sarcasm. If you say, like that's a good plan, the rest of that is evaluative. That is a good plan. You could say that sarcastically without the like prefix. And in this case, it gets stuck under like prefix sarcasm because it has a like in front of it. Other than that, it's just propositional sarcasm. It's just asserting a proposition, pretending that it's true, but when actuality you are intending the contrary, and then evaluating it on the contrary. So, also can work with this evaluative scale. I'm sorry, without the evaluation scale of propositional sarcasm. Like I would ever marry him, there's no evaluation. Like she's actually going to come to your party, there's no evaluation there. Like I can even pick that up, right? If you want me to help you move your couch, and I say like I can lift that. There's no evaluation of good or bad or how well you've done. You know, great job slipping and falling in the hallway. It's just it's a statement about the world, prefixed by like, in which case I intend the inverse of what's being said. I can even lift that. It means I can pick that up. But when you stick that like in front of it and prefix it with that, suddenly it becomes the inverse of what's being said. Like I can lift that means there's no way I can pick that up, right? So that's like prefix, and then the last one is illocutionary sarcasm. We've talked about illocution. That's the meaning that you have when you say a sentence. And this is different than propositional and like prefix sarcasm. These are cases in which we, as sarcastic speakers, don't intend just to merely communicate the inverse of what is said, but rather the entire illocutionary act associated with what's being said. So, were this utterance sincere, the illocutionary style sarcasm isn't just an inverse of the words, just an inverse of the locution, it's an inverse of the entire illocutionary act. So, if I say to you, hey, thanks for helping me clean the house, I don't mean the inverse of that. I don't mean thanks for not helping me clean the house. I don't sincerely mean to thank you for not helping me clean the house. And I don't mean I'm not thanking you for cleaning the house. Those are the inverses of thanks for helping me clean the house. So I'm not just trying to invert or put forward the contrary of the actual locution, but the contrary of the entire illocutionary act. So if I sincerely say to you, because you did help me clean my house, hey, thanks for cleaning my house, my illocutionary act then is to say, you did something praiseworthy, you helped me clean my house, thank you for that. We should, go hang out because you're a great guy, right? But in the illocutionary sarcasm, unlike propositional and like prefix, I'm not inverting the propositions, I'm inverting the unspoken illocutionary act. If you don't help me clean my house, and I sarcastically say, hey, thanks for helping me with that, I don't mean, right, like I said, thanks for not helping me, and I don't mean I'm not thanking you for helping me. Those are the inverses of what's said. I'm intending to invert the illocutionary act. What I'm saying is you should have done something praiseworthy that you did not do, and so I'm scorning you for not doing this praiseworthy thing that you said you would help me with. So it's an inverse of the unspoken words rather than the spoken words, like in propositional and like prefix. So that's my favorite one. It's a little more subtle, right? And it's a little cooler. And like I said, I've been called sarcastic my whole life, even when I don't mean to be. So one of the main goals in this whole sarcasm thing is a much bigger project I'm working on with. So I'm in the neurophilosophy track at Georgia State. So we do philosophy, a lot of philosophy of mind, and we're trying to get some more folks to help me out with language. One of the things that we do is look at how the brain works in behavior and how certain things affect the brain and how you know how it works. I don't need to explain it. So it turns out that sarcasm has got some great neurological stuff going on. It's good for you, right? Sarcasm is good for you. So when I say something sarcastic to someone, I don't have to feel bad anymore because it's actually helping them out. It turns out that sarcasm is important for more than just showing how witty you are. It actually will increase your creativity, your ability to understand. Recent studies have shown that a lack of an ability to understand and recognize sarcasm is a sign that something's going really wrong in the brain. It can actually be an early warning sign of some medical issues. Recent research has shown that exposure to sarcasm can increase creative thinking and problem-solving abilities. So there's an article in the Smithsonian that talks about this on Smithsonian Magazine website, whatever it is, smithsonianmag.com or whatever. You can find it. There was a study in Israel, some college students in Israel, and they were given some sarcastic complaints from a cell phone company. And they were given just some angry complaints from a cell phone company, the customers of this cell phone company. And it turns out that these students, when they listened to the sarcastic complaints of the customers could much more creatively and much more quickly solve the customer's problem. If they listened to the guy who just yelled and told the customer service rep what an idiot he was and how I'm never going to shop here ever again, yeah, right. The creative problem, the ability to solve problems creatively diminished. It was almost like a stressor. And then just when they are given just sort of neutral problems to solve that don't involve sarcasm or anger, just here's a problem, solve it. That was sort of the baseline. Sarcastic complaints, the creativity went way high. So sarcasm is good for you. The extra work that our brain does seems to make us sharper. When we hear a sarcastic utterance, our brain works harder. It lights up more than if we hear the same sentence uttered sincerely. So if I say, hey, great job when you fall in the hallway, your brain works harder to interpret that sentence than it does if you get a 100 on a test and I say, great job. Your brain works harder, and it seems like the evidence seems to be pointing to the fact that extra work exercises the brain in such a way that it makes our problem-solving abilities better. Like I said, detecting sarcasm, the inability to detect sarcasm can show some signs of brain damage and brain issues. Tumor growth in the temporal lobes or the parahippocampus. Tumor growth in those areas actually decreases one's ability to interpret sarcasm. So if you're really good at sarcasm and you're really good at understanding it, and then suddenly you don't get when people are being sarcastic, you need to go to the doctor. You might have a tumor on your temporal lobe. So it turns out that sarcasm does really good things for us. And there's some research that we're doing. We're looking into why there is an inability to detect sarcasm in children and adults with autism. Certain head injuries, the ability to detect sarcasm goes away. Schizophrenia, the ability to detect sarcasm goes away. And in certain types of dementia, the ability to detect sarcasm goes away. Frontotemporal dementia, your ability to detect sarcasm goes away. So we're, those of us, not me because I don't have the machine to scan the brain yet, but I'm looking, I'm going to get it. And I'm not going to get it, but I'm going to get somebody to let me use it. We're looking at what's going on in the brain, why it is that the brain works the way that it does, how are we interpreting language, and why is it that these certain damages can decrease our ability to interpret non-literal language. So it's the temporal lobes, the parahippocampus, they seem to pick up sarcastic tones. Your left and right frontal lobes seem to be involved in interpreting literal statements and hearing the tones of literal statements and then interpreting the literal statements, respectively. So a lack of sarcasm detection, like I said, can be a good signal that something really bad is going on. So there's research going into that. Why is it that our brains work the way they do with non-literal language? And then as we continue that study, hopefully we'll be able to delve farther into the way that the brain works and how that influences behavior, and then just our general understanding of the way the world works. So if there are any questions, I will take questions. If not, I'm finished. Thank you so much for the invitation to come. Again, deepest apologies for the tardiness. It's not my fault. It's your highway's fault. J.L. Austin. Is it John? James? Is it John Austin? Yeah. It's A-U-S-T-I-N, not like Jane Austen with an E. Cool. Thank you. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
This is the question specifically. It's just an observation, perhaps. That I think sarcasm is really interesting in the ways that so often it's kind of a bonding experience. And when you don't get somebody else's sarcasm, it's an exclusionary thing, and you kind of see it sometimes, when well, in a variety of contexts. As a teacher, when you say something sarcastic and the students don't get it, you have this real sense like we are not on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
It's like an indication that we're not communicating. And I've seen it like with my kids when they were teenagers, that my inability to get their sarcasm was, a basis for, huge guffaws.
Yeah, farther separation.
Yeah, there's a way in which sarcasm, it seems to me, and that's probably related to the way in which humor works perhaps also, but that there's a real social element to it, that it's not surprising to me at all that it would be that people with autism would have difficulty with it, because it just seems like there's so much in the notion of being able to understand somebody else's sarcasm that is so social.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it seems to have some, almost like our sort of built-in evolutionary fears of the dark and fear of heights and these sorts of things that have just caused us to survive. Sarcasm and the ability to interpret those things seems to have a, like you said, a social aspect, wherein which it was a means to survival, right? It increased social organization and led to more reproduction. And so that was brought up by, gosh, I forgot his name. He cited it, again. There's an article about some of that on the Smithsonian's website. They talk about that also. Some of the social aspects of sarcasm that it, really seemed to, when we began to communicate through language many years ago, the ability to get it brought people closer together, and then those that didn't get it were the outsiders. So those sort of built-in fears, those built-in social tools, it seems to work the same way. So it's just this, like Steven Pinker's, it's almost like an instinct, a linguistic instinct that's stuck in there, this ability to be sarcastic, which is what I try to tell people. I'm not a jerk, I'm just living out my genetic predisposition to survive by being sarcastic.
I mean, it might have, I can see how it could have evolutionary advantages, but I guess I'm not even so sure that that's the only purpose of it,
Yeah, even now, right.
That there aren't just, it's just, as you said, I mean, it's a marker for exclusion and exclusion.
Yeah.
For whatever value or lack of value there is in that, that seems interesting to me.
Yeah. There was actually a study done on the North and the South in the United States, and it seems like Northerners laugh more at sarcasm than Southerners and tend to get it more often. So there's that. I don't know if that's worth, but there you go.
I think it's related in some ways to what's considered rude and what's not considered rude.
Yeah.
That a lot of what in the North passes for being witty is in other circumstances viewed as rude.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I wonder along those same lines. I guess when you were speaking, I was wondering about the effectiveness of sarcasm in sort of transversing these, maybe transversing difficulties that people have between each other, and whether or not this is maybe if you suggest that there is this north-south split, that it would be a cultural difference about whether or not this was an effective tool. But I wonder what you think about sort of. I mean, you gave the example of the supermarket, but what about when like people have like high stakes on both sides, and what do you?
High stakes on both sides.
I guess something that comes to my attention is a thing that's been bubbling up today. I don't know if you've heard about it, but there's been like a Colbert Report sort of thing, where Colbert said something in jest, and someone said, well, I know what you were saying was in jest, but it seems to be racist. And then so like there's underlying racist here, but like, and so the response from Colbert has been, or the response from the report has been sort of sarcastic.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if this is an effective way to deal with someone who legitimately feels slighted, who you did not intend to offend, who in fact you were intending.
Is this the one about Asian Americans?
This is, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I saw Colbert's defense of that. I didn't hear him use the word sarcastic because that's come out from like Comedy Central or whoever it was that produces it, I guess. But
yeah,
so they're wrong, right? It's not sarcasm. It's something totally different. I mean, it may be inappropriate. It may be morally repugnant to make fun of Asian Americans in the way that he did, but it's not sarcasm. It was just satire, I guess.
Yeah. I don't mean the initial act, but like, so the response was sort of that's not my Twitter account, and he has another Twitter account that he actually is himself in that Twitter account, and he says I had no idea about this other Twitter account, which is him sort of laughing off the whole issue, but so it's like I mean, it's not funny to the people
Right,
that
yeah,
are
yeah.
legitimately hurt.
Yeah, so I say to some level, sarcasm is good for you, right? And I don't mean that across the board, because it can be extremely hurtful, like to a young child if you discipline the child sarcastically. Trying to find articles on sarcasm is extremely difficult, even on like JSTOR. All of the articles on sarcasm, not all of them, but a majority of the articles on sarcasm are written in the 1950s about why teachers shouldn't be allowed to use sarcasm in the classroom because of its detrimental effects on the mental health of children. And then apparently that went away because they all written from like 1955 to 1958, and that was it. So it can be, so it's not an excuse for saying whatever you want to say, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Is how do we balance between sarcasm and appropriateness, I guess?
Yeah.
Is that close to what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's at a large degree cultural in the way that we interpret sarcasm and the way that what we see as appropriate. And it shifts, right? So in 1930, a sarcastic remark about an Asian American would have gotten no backlash. Like, watch Breakfast at Tiffany's. It's extremely racist towards Asian Americans. It was like one of the best movies ever made in that time period. It's extremely racist. And then things shift. So when we're dealing with sarcasm and any language in general, or any linguistic sort of act in general, it's going to rely heavily on the culture that you're in. So if I say something sarcastic like "great job," they may not get that, even if they learn to speak English in India, right? You know, they have a different sort of sarcasm. They do a different sort of thing. It is interesting though that even their sarcasm does still fall into these four categories. But yeah, so there's a balance between appropriateness and sarcasm. So it's not certainly an excuse. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So this is an entirely different question. So when you're talking about the neurobiology or whatever, you started mentioning a lot more about being able to register tone. However, at least as far as I can tell in the standard view, which is your preferred view, there's not an accounting for tone in sarcasm. It's about a shared assumption. Whereas, so I would imagine in a lot of instances of sarcasm, the way that someone determines you're being sarcastic isn't because you have some sort of shared assumption, because you may not know the person.
Right.
For instance, if a stranger comes up to you after you fall in the hall and goes, "Do you need help?" and if you go, "No," they'll just walk along. Whereas if you go, "No,"
Yeah.
so that is all about the tone and nothing about any shared assumption whatsoever, as
Yeah.
far as I can tell. So the sort of philosophical accounts then, the standard view, if it's just this sort of Gricean thing, it seems rather insufficient.
Yeah, I think I don't know how far Grice goes with the shared assumption. I would lump under the shared assumptions the way we use tones. So as you and I are English speakers, we're going to register each other's tones. So if I say "great job," does that sound sincere? Because apparently everything I say sounds sarcastic. If I say to you, "Hey, you did a great job," but if I sort of sneer it and hold my mouth a certain way and say "great job," because we're both English speakers from relatively the same part of the world, we know that that's not how we say "great job" when we sincerely mean "great job." So under assumptions, I would include the way that we use tones. So if you speak Hindi, for instance, the tones are different when you use a question. I think that it starts up and goes down, whereas ours starts down and goes up, or that may be reversed, I don't know. So the inflection of tones is different in different languages. So what may sound questioning to you in Hindi is actually a sentence, and what may sound questioning to them in English is actually a declarative sentence. So that I would lump that under assumed assumptions. Tone and the way that we hold our mouths, we cock our heads, those sorts of things.
I mean, so I guess that would be a shared. You're right. It's a shared something.
Yeah.
But I mean, for the strictly Gricean view, the assumptions, because you couldn't have possibly meant what you said. I can have possibly meant what I said. And you're sitting there on the floor and go, "No,
Yeah.
I don't need your help."
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think I think you're right. I think Grice's account is not sufficient to include all that we understand about sarcasm. That it's just this, you couldn't have possibly meant what you said, because there are instances when the thing is sarcasm that you could possibly mean. I really want to marry that guy. it's possible that you really do, right? Somebody might really want to marry you. And yet, if I know you and you know me, and I say I really want to marry that guy, or girl, or whatever the case may be, if we know each other and you know how I talk and you know that I hate that person and don't want to marry that person, then we've got this shared assumption. If not, then it's just going to have to sort of be either you don't get my sarcasm because we don't have some sort of shared mutual understanding, and maybe mutual understanding is a better term than assumption, because then we can lump things like tone and sneers and facial expressions under understanding better than we can assumption. But so it may just be the case that you don't get my sarcasm or I don't get your sarcasm.
So is it a consequence of the standard view that if someone doesn't share the relevant whatever, is it that your sarcasm fails, or that it's impossible to be sarcastic in that situation? Because the way it's construed is that there has to be a pair of people who share something, and if that pair isn't there, it's not that you fail, it's that sarcasm is impossible. Which way would you construe?
It would. You failed because it's impossible.
Yeah.
At least it's impossible in that way. Maybe you can rephrase your sarcasm if you're really determined to be sarcastic. You might be able to rephrase it, but I mean, if there's that big of a disconnect culturally and linguistically between two people, yeah, it would be really hard for me to learn Spanish and I don't speak any other language other than English, Latin, which doesn't count. And then only in books. I can't even speak it, just read it. But so it would be really hard for me to just like take Spanish for 3 or 4 years and get sarcasm in Spanish, I think. And so I think someone talking to me in a language that I've just recently learned can't be sarcastic. There's just no way that I can get it. Unless their sarcasm is so similar to the way we do it in English that I then can get it, yeah. Yes, sir.
So I want to follow up on some of the threads that both Rosie and Evan were sort of drawing on, although I think I have it going in a different direction. The analysis that you talked about, the versions that the interpretations you talked about today, sort of centered around some sort of inversion in the locution and illocutionary act. But wondering if sarcasm isn't more properly about the, what's the phrase, the perlocution?
The perlocutionary act.
Perlocutionary effect.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And that sarcasm shouldn't be considered something more like a performative. And my thinking is this, that when you, as someone who tries to do sarcasm on someone, and I can wield quite a bit of it, I find, and they don't get it, there's a frustration that goes on there, right? And you can't explain it and explain the inversion that you meant and then get the result that you hoped for.
It's not nearly
right?
as fun.
What you need them to change how they feel and think, right? And there's a social element to this, right? So you're bonding in there. And so I think this is also part of the reason why it's hard to be sarcastic with those from another language culture, because if you just literally explain the inversion, whichever version of the inversion you prefer, it doesn't achieve anything like the effects of sarcasm. And so that's why I'm thinking that sarcasm is about changing a person, not really about communicating a proposition in a peculiar way, right? And that because even if you accomplished the communication of the proposition or the inversion of the proposition, or you got them to understand your thoughts or expressed your thoughts, that still doesn't necessarily satisfy what you want, right? You want more than them to comprehend what you're communicating. You want them to be sort of affected and transformed by that in a way that's very personal, right? In some manner.
Yeah, so I think there'd be something deeply unsatisfying about saying the literal thing that you want to say. I mean, there's something about sarcasm that's satisfying in a certain way, where if I just told you what I meant literally, there's an effect that's not there. There's a satisfaction, at least on my part, that's not there. And I think it seems like if your attempt is to not as an educator professionally, but if you attempt to educate someone on something, it seems like they get it better. If they get the sarcasm, it seems like it sticks better. There's something about sarcasm that works in a better way than just speaking literally, I think. So yeah, you're right. So I mean, all language we hope, right, that all of our language has some sort of perlocutionary effect. If and nothing else, the person understands what I mean. So yeah, I think there's something important in what you're saying that will definitely be